Have you ever looked at someone and known something was wrong before they said a single word? Not because they told you, not because you had proof. You just knew. Maybe it was a pause that lasted half a second too long, a smile that looked right, but didn't feel real, a change in someone's voice that nobody else seemed to notice. Most people ignore those moments, but you don't. And if you're anything like me, you've probably questioned yourself because of it. Am I overthinking? Am I imagining things? Why do I notice things that nobody else seems to see? For years, many people dismiss this as intuition. Others call it anxiety. Some even call it paranoia. But what if that's not what's happening at all? More than 100 years ago, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote something remarkable. He believed that most people don't simply wear clothes. They wear masks. Not because they're dishonest, because that's how human beings survive. We hide fear behind confidence, pain behind humor, loneliness behind success. The version of ourselves that the world sees isn't always the one that's real. The question is, why do some people notice those masks almost immediately, while others never see them at all? Modern psychology has an interesting answer. Reading people isn't magic. It isn't luck, and it isn't a gift that appears overnight. Very often, it's the result of a brain that learned, through experience, to pay attention to the smallest details. Sometimes because it was curious, sometimes because it had to. Today, we'll explore the psychology behind reading people, why some minds naturally notice what others miss, and why this ability is both one of the greatest strengths and one of the heaviest burdens a person can carry. Part 2. Reading people usually starts long before you realize you're doing it. For a long time, I thought reading people was just intuition. You either had it or you didn't. But the more I paid attention, the more I realized it wasn't that simple. Most people think they're listening when they meet someone. In reality, they're mostly listening to the words. People with rare intelligence often do something different without even realizing it. They notice the pause before the answer, the smile that appears a second too late, the confidence that feels just a little forced. None of those things prove anything on their own, but the brain doesn't look at them one by one. It quietly puts them together. I've caught myself doing this more times than I can count. Someone would tell me everything was fine. I'd smile, nod, and keep talking. But somewhere in the back of my mind, something didn't fit. I couldn't explain it in that moment. There was no evidence, just a small feeling that something wasn't matching up. Sometimes I was wrong, but surprisingly often, weeks later, I'd find out that the person had been struggling all along. That's when I started asking a different question. Maybe I wasn't predicting people. Maybe I was simply noticing things most people walked past. Psychologists have an interesting explanation for this. Our brains are always collecting information. Most of it never reaches conscious thought. Your eyes notice tiny changes in expression. Your ears pick up changes in tone. Your brain compares those signals with thousands of experiences you've already had. By the time you say, something feels off, your mind has already done far more work than you realize. The strange part is that you only become aware of the conclusion. You never see the process. And maybe that's why this ability feels mysterious. Not because it's magic, but because your brain solved the puzzle before it showed you the answer. Part 3. The best people readers aren't looking for lies. They're looking for patterns. One thing I've learned over the years is this. People who are good at reading others aren't constantly trying to catch someone lying. They're paying attention to patterns. Anyone can have a bad day. Anyone can sound nervous. Anyone can act differently once in a while. One moment doesn't tell you much. but a pattern does. That's the difference. Personally, I rarely trust a first impression. I trust consistency, or the lack of it. When someone's words keep matching their actions, trust naturally grows. But when those two things slowly drift apart, my attention does too. Not because I'm suspicious, because the pattern has changed. I think that's how many highly observant people experience the world. They're not collecting dramatic moments. They're collecting small ones. A promise that wasn't kept. A smile that disappears too quickly. Kind words followed by cold behavior. Each detail seems unimportant by itself, but together they begin to tell a story. That's why people with rare intelligence often notice changes before everyone else. Not because they can read minds, but because they've quietly been reading patterns all along. And once you learn to notice patterns instead of isolated moments, people become much easier to understand. Not because they reveal more, because you start seeing the parts they've been revealing little by little all along. Part 4. The hardest person to read is usually the one trying the hardest to look perfect. One idea from Nietzsche has stayed with me for a long time. He believed that people don't always show who they are. They show who they think they need to be. The older I get, the more I think he was right. Most people don't wake up planning to fake their personality. They simply learn which parts of themselves feel safe to show. Confidence can hide insecurity. Humor can hide pain. Kindness can sometimes hide the fear of being rejected. That's why I've learned to pay less attention to the image someone is trying to present, and more attention to the moments they stop managing it. The few seconds after they receive unexpected news, the way they treat someone who has nothing to offer them, the way they react when things don't go their way. Those moments are difficult to rehearse. They reveal far more than a carefully chosen sentence ever could. I think this is why first impressions can be misleading. People can control their words. They can even control their body language for a while. But very few people can control every small reaction all the time. Sooner or later, the real person begins to appear. Not in the big moments, in the small ones. So if you want to understand people better, don't rush to judge what they say. Watch what stays consistent when they think nobody is paying attention. Because the mask usually slips for just a second. And sometimes that's all you need to see the person underneath. Part 5. The better you become at reading people, the harder it becomes to ignore what you see. This is the part nobody really talks about. People often think reading others is a gift, and it is, but it can also be exhausting, because once you start noticing what's happening beneath the surface, it's hard to pretend you don't. I've been in conversations where everything sounded perfectly normal. People were smiling, laughing, saying all the right things, but something felt off. Not dramatic, just different. A smile that didn't reach the eyes. A voice that sounded warm but somehow distant. Tiny things that most people would never notice. The difficult part is that you can't simply switch that awareness off. Your brain keeps collecting information even when you wish it wouldn't. Over time, that changes the way you see relationships. You become slower to trust, not because you've become negative, because you've learned that words and reality don't always match. But here's something I've had to remind myself more than once. Seeing more doesn't always mean knowing more. Sometimes we notice a pattern correctly. Sometimes we're only seeing one small piece of a much bigger story. That's why true wisdom isn't just noticing people. It's staying curious about them. If this sounds familiar, leave a 5 in the comments below. I'd love to know if you've ever had the feeling that something wasn't right long before anyone else noticed it. Because reading people isn't about proving you're right. It's about understanding that every person is carrying a story you can't fully see. The more you remember that, the sharper your perception becomes. And at the same time, the kinder it becomes. Part 6. The cost of seeing what other people miss. The ability to read people comes with a price. And I don't think enough people talk about that. Most people assume that if you understand others well, relationships must be easier. From what I've experienced, that's not always true. Sometimes they're harder, because you notice things you wish you didn't. You notice when someone's smile isn't genuine. You notice when a friend says they're fine, but their eyes say something completely different. You notice when someone starts pulling away long before they admit it. The strange part is that you can't unsee those things. Once your brain notices a pattern, it keeps watching. It keeps comparing. It keeps asking, has something changed? That's mentally exhausting. Not because you're trying to judge people, because your mind rarely stops observing. Personally, I've had moments where I wished I could just enjoy a conversation without analysing it. Just take people's words at face value. But that's easier said than done. When your brain has spent years learning to notice small signals, it keeps doing that automatically. The important thing I've learned is this: you don't have to react to everything you notice. Not every inconsistency means someone is lying. Not every change in behaviour means something is wrong. Sometimes people are simply tired. Sometimes they're stressed. Sometimes they're carrying a burden you'll never know about. Reading people is valuable, but knowing when not to jump to conclusions is even more valuable. I think that's where real wisdom begins. Not when you become good at seeing through people, but when you become patient enough to let the full picture reveal itself. Because the best observers don't just notice quickly, they wait long enough to understand completely. Part 7. The greatest mistake is believing you can fully understand someone too quickly. The more people I meet, the more I realize something. Reading people is a skill, but assuming you already know everything about them is a trap. I've seen this happen many times. Someone notices one red flag, one strange reaction, one uncomfortable conversation, and within minutes, they've already decided who that person is. I don't think that's wisdom. I think that's certainty pretending to be wisdom. Real observation takes time, because people are more complicated than a single moment. Someone can seem cold because they're grieving. Someone can seem distant because they're overwhelmed. Someone can seem confident while quietly falling apart inside. That's why I've learned to treat my first impression as a starting point, not a final answer. I pay attention. I stay curious. Then I wait. Time has a way of revealing what first impressions cannot. I think this is where Nietzsche's idea becomes especially valuable. He wasn't encouraging us to judge people more quickly. He was encouraging us to look beyond appearances, to question what seems obvious, to remember that every person wears a mask for a reason. Some wear it to impress, some wear it to protect themselves, and some have worn it for so long that they no longer realize it's there. The real art of reading people isn't seeing through the mask immediately. It's having the patience to understand why it was put on in the first place. Because when you understand that, you stop becoming a better judge of people. You become a better student of human nature. Part 8. The person you understand best should eventually be yourself. After spending years trying to understand other people, I think many of us eventually discover something surprising. The hardest person to understand isn't the person sitting across from us. It's ourselves. When you're good at reading people, it's easy to make a habit of looking outward. You notice what others are feeling. You notice what they need. You notice what they're trying not to say. But somewhere along the way, you stop asking yourself those same questions. I know I've done that. I became so focused on understanding everyone else that I rarely stopped to ask, what am I feeling right now? What do I actually need? What am I avoiding? And that's a dangerous habit, because the ability to understand people means very little if you never turn that awareness inward. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who knows others is wise. He who knows himself is enlightened." I think there's a lot of truth in that. Reading people can help you build better relationships. But understanding yourself changes your entire life. It helps you notice your own fears, your own patterns, the stories you've been telling yourself without questioning them. Maybe that's the real purpose of learning to read people. Not to become better at judging others, but to become more honest with yourself. Because in the end, the greatest insight isn't realizing who someone else really is. It's finally understanding who you've been all along. Final thoughts: reading people is not about seeing through them. It's about understanding them. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this video, it's this. The art of reading people isn't about becoming impossible to fool. It isn't about winning every conversation. And it isn't about proving that your first impression was right. It's about learning to see human beings with a little more clarity and a little more compassion. For a long time, I thought reading people meant spotting lies. Now I think it's something much quieter than that. It's noticing when someone is carrying more than they're saying. It's recognizing that confidence can hide fear, that anger can hide pain, that silence can sometimes be a person asking for help in the only way they know how. The more I learn about people, the less interested I become in judging them. I'm more interested in understanding them, because every person you meet is fighting a battle you probably know nothing about. And sometimes the mask they're wearing isn't there to deceive you. It's there because at some point in their life, it helped them survive. Maybe that's what Nietzsche was trying to teach. Don't stop at appearances. Look deeper. Question what seems obvious. And never assume you've completely understood another person after a single moment. If this video made you look at people a little differently, leave a 7 in the comments below. I'd love to know which idea stayed with you the most. And before you go, there's one question that's even more personal than this one. If you can read other people so well, why do you still feel like so few people truly understand you? We'll explore why people with rare intelligence often feel misunderstood, why they struggle to explain what they see, and why that loneliness is far more common than most people realize. Because sometimes the greatest challenge isn't learning to read people. It's finding someone who can read you. Until next time, stay curious. Not just about the people around you, but about the person you're becoming every time you choose understanding over judgment.